My husband has this great shrink, and he is very brilliant and writes books called George Macari. And George Macari said to Matt Greenfield about me, he said, sometimes the children of narcissists become stuck on trying to fix their relationships with their narcissistic parents, despite the fact that there's not any role for them to play, and that they become overly guilty because of that. And that made so much sense that it made me think that that's what I did.
Let's talk about who your mom is for people that don't know. Your mom, because it is part of the story, because it informs her narcissism
and her too,
and her quest for fame that really fucked with her in a lot of ways, which I think was interesting. So you write very smartly about famous and becoming unfamous, actually. So your mom became very famous as a so-called second-wave feminist after her 1973 autobiographical novel, Fear of Flying. Everything after that was Fear of. It's sexually explicit, sex positive, as most people say today, and also very funny. It was published before you were born. Talk a little bit about the fame and how it impacted you, especially the Fear of Flying, which I don't think as many younger people know these days or wouldn't find very shocking, but at the time it most certainly was shocking. I remember it as a 10-year-old. I was like, whoa. Yeah. And everyone was looking for the book to read. All the 10 to 12-year-olds were looking for the book to read.
So, yes, it was very shocking. It published in 1973. I think the way to think of it is contextually the pill, right? Game changer. But it takes a little while to sort of get into the culture. 1973, Fear of Flying, and also Roe v. Wade the same year. And from what I understand from people coming over and telling me about it, which I think is sort of the most useful kind of thing, is that there were many women who read that book and were like, I've been doing it wrong. Like, I can have sex, I don't have to be married to the first person I sleep with. It was just sort of like, you don't have to be what your parents told you needed to be. So, and remember, my mom was born in 1942. So I think what was hard for her was she really did want to be an academic. My grandfather he had 3 daughters, and his whole thing was everyone needed to be an academic. They all needed to get graduate degrees. She went to Barnard. She was a good student. She was actually with Martha Stewart at Barnard.
Oh, wow. That would have been something.
And she did sleep with Andy Stewart.
Oh, okay. All right, good.
And I said, did you ruin Martha Stewart's marriage?
Yeah.
First, she said, this is very Erica Jong. She said, what happens in Frankfurt stays in Frankfurt.
Okay.
At the book fair.
Okay.
I was like, okay.
Yeah.
And then she said, many people slept with Andy Stewart.
Oh, so not my fault.
Not my fault. I actually think that Martha was really mad at my mom because years later, my father got married, remarried, a few years later, not that many years later, and Martha really wanted to do the wedding, which I feel like was a sign that she was not pleased.
Well, that's a nice side story, but anyway, she was very famous. Your mother, like, it was.
Yes.
It was
She was.
There
very
were several
famous,
Betty Friedan. There was a bunch of women writers that came up, and hers was the sort of the sexy one.
Yes.
The sexy. I remember many of the appearances she had on a lot of the TV shows. She was often on television shows, and they were more titillated by her. You could feel that, right? How did that impact you? Here you are. She was famous when you were born, which you wouldn't have realized for quite a few years, but she was, say, 10 years into it.
She was glamorous and interesting and smart. It's important to remember that the world in which I grew up in doesn't exist anymore. So there was Norman Mailer and Tom Wolfe, and there were these fancy male journalists who dominated everything. They wrote for Vanity Fair and GQ and The New Yorker, and they had these outsized influences in the culture. And they don't really exist anymore. Like, that's not how we do it anymore.
No, we have Theo Vaughn now.
Right. Right, exactly. And that's not so good. But so they had these outsized influences in the culture, and she could never get in that group. And that was very hard for her.
How did it impact you?
I think I was uniquely poorly designed for that childhood because I was dyslexic. So that was a real problem. And I was also, I got sober at 19 because I really was an alcoholic. Like, I really was. I do believe that there are some people who are born alcoholics, and I really had that DNA.
Well, she was, and your grandmother was.
Yeah, grandmother was too, yeah. But I had, in my DNA, just such the ism, if that makes sense. I was extremely ill-prepared for that childhood. But I got through it, and I had this weird... And my mom, she had people who sort of took care of her.
Yeah, she left you alone a lot, which is what you write about. When you say ill-prepared, I think she was ill-prepared for you.
Yeah. I mean, I also think... She was not, there was just a lot of, you have to remember, it is also the 70s and 80s. And, people didn't parent the way they do now, right? We didn't have car seats. Everybody smoked. When I was 3 years old, I drank the bottoms of everyone's glasses of champagne at a bat mitzvah, and everyone thought it was adorable. Like, it was just a very different way to grow up. And there were other kids I met who were the children of famous people who also were sort of dragged along.
It's interesting because right now you're saying, oh, it wasn't so weird. It actually was so weird. It is. Like, when I talk about my mom, everyone's like, I used to say, oh, a lot of people are like that. They weren't.
Right.
They weren't. Right? And I have a really hard time with my wife, whose parents are so lovely. Like, wouldn't be better parents. And very similar to how I parent my kids. Like, you can see it. And I was like, people aren't like this. And I sometimes, when the only real fight we have is, I was like, you don't understand what it was like to be raised by wolves, because you weren't.
Right.
Like, you don't understand, like, the constant lack of attention. And I think one of the things you struggle with was feeling like you're being a bad daughter to a woman who doesn't seem like she was a very good mother.
Right.
I want to play one of the passages that really hit home. This is right after you moved your mom and stepdad in what you call the world's most expensive nursing home, which is where I've been moving my mother, too. Let's listen to this.
A couple of days later, I called my dad, my one remaining parent. I was in a taxi heading to CNN to do a late-night panel. I told him that Mom wasn't dead yet, but that she wasn't exactly in there anymore. I told him that all she did was sleep and drink. I told him how guilty I felt. I said that I shouldn't be at the CNN studios. Wherever I was, I felt I should have been somewhere else. I should have been spending more time with my kids, with my parents, with my dogs, with my cancerous husband. My dad tried to reassure me in his own peculiar, fucked up way. He said, when you were a little girl, the nanny and I used to try to get your mom to spend time with you. We tried to get her to spend just an hour a day with you. This admission made me feel so great. She couldn't do it, my dad said. She couldn't even spend 1 hour with you. The most she could do was half an hour.
You didn't know that. Yeah. You write that you spent a lot of time wondering if you weren't taking care of them because they didn't take care of you. I think a lot of people in the sandwich generation can relate to that.
Yeah.
Do you still feel guilt about not taking care of her? Because it sounds like she hardly took care of you. And I do want to ask about your father. Why isn't he as culpable in that?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, it's a good question. So do I still feel guilty? The answer is not really. I think what happened was, if you want to get into the sort of nitty gritty of the divorce, they had this really just epic divorce. In the end, he kind of gave up and went away. Not the best answer, but people didn't have joint custody back then.
Right, men certainly didn't.
So, but he's subsequently apologized to me and said I should have fought harder. I think it was very hard for him and for her. Mm-hmm. My grandfather had introduced them, and it was they were going, I think they thought in 1975 when they met, or 74, that they were going to get together and they were both going to become these famous writers, and they were going to live in Malibu and have this life that was this sort of fantasy. And what happened instead was they got together and they were going to kill each other, and she was an alcoholic, and he had, a lot of issues with his dad, and everything just imploded. And then they couldn't, it just was all of the sort of worst of everything.